If you were to assign yourself a D&D class right now, what would it be? Personally, I feel like I would be a bard.
Wizard.
Oh, wizard. I feel like both those fit.
Yeah, because I'm always making the magic happen.
No.
No, yeah. No multi-classing. Come on.
Wait. So how about Jay? You say what you think you are, and then we'll all assign each other a class.
I love that. Let's do it.
Okay. I feel like I would either be an inquisitive rogue or a bard. But
I would think more bard. Jake.
Yeah, either of those.
Jake,
I feel
Jake
like.
is,
but if I'm not allowed to multi-class,
the playing music and like the dancing stuff, like not so much for Jake. But as far as like just deep charisma, deep wells of charisma, and the ability to just talk people into anything, but also like buff the party with like interesting thoughts.
Yeah, so he's kind of bardic.
Thought buffing.
Bardic.
Maybe he's a warlock. He's a little devious.
Dude, if the void was a patron, then sign me up.
It's so dark.
I'm pretty sure it is.
Okay, so assign me a class.
See, I'd say either wizard. I think it's bard. I think it's bard.
So I don't think wizard would work for me because that's like academic and you have to like study hard to get it. But I'm actually a terrible student.
You could be more of a sorcerer.
I'd be a sorcerer.
You'd be a sorcerer. Oh
yeah. Sorcerer or bard for sure.
I could see him as like a druid maybe.
I did play a druid for a long time in World of Warcraft.
Use him as a little druid boy.
That's what they called him.
All right, David. David is...
Oh, man. I say I'm a wizard. What do you say?
Oh. I see David as an artificer. Like the Unearthed Arcana class. Because he's just like loves to tinker and think about stuff in a weird way. What's the right word? Because the Artificer was just like two classes kind of like merged into one. And it felt very homebrew. And I think that David is a homebrew kind of guy.
Yep. Yeah, I'd go with that. I mean, that, or I think David's wizard. I think that...
So I think that would fit. Even though we said no multi-classing, David is actually 2 levels in every class.
Just a little bit of everything.
I mean, I think David is the wizard though, because I hate the wizard the most.
Oh my gosh.
Oh no. Welcome to Vox Arcana. I'm William.
I'm Jake.
I'm David.
And this is a Dungeons & Dragons podcast, episode 12, Fighter Class. We're starting our new class series, so look for that every other week. Our first class is the Fighter.
The Fighter, the most common class in the game.
Human Fighter.
Human Fighter level 1.
It's astronomical how many people play a human fighter. It is by far, like, no competition, the most common race and class combination. And I don't know, why do you guys think that is? Why do you think the fighter is such a common class that people pick?
I really think that it's something that people can easily relate to the most. So if you look at the fighter, they're pretty basic in what they can do. They're the human, being a human is what most people are when you're playing D&D. I've never met someone who's not human who's played D&D.
I've
played with a few non-humans.
She was really weird.
The only non-human that I can think of is maybe Mark Zuckerberg. But...
Whoa!
You played with him?
No, but I imagine he plays.
He played a lizard folk, I'm guessing.
No, I thought he played a cyborg.
This is why you're supposed to get out of your comfort zone and play something that you're not already physically.
Oh, God.
All right, so what is a fighter? David, take it away. What is a fighter?
I think a fighter is someone who really accelerates in combat.
Accelerates in combat? He's driving a car in combat. I'm in the first gear. Off we go.
To the races, boys. This is Need for Speed now.
God.
Can we make like a car version of D&D where everybody's just a different type of car?
Well, no. Let's just do Cars,
the more you talk.
the movie, but just the D&D version.
Oh, well, I've actually already played that.
Wait, really?
I called it Cars and Crossroads, and no, I'm kidding.
So a fighter is someone. A fighter is.
Are you about to say that fighter is someone who excels at fighting? Because I'm going to hit you in the face.
So a fighter is someone who is really good in combat, specifically using melee weapons or ranged weapons.
I feel like you're describing literally every class in the game right now.
So
What makes them different?
what makes them different is that, as written in 5e, not a lot.
What?
In my opinion.
What?
I think the
Disagree.
fighter class is pretty bland. In my opinion.
A bland. Well, okay. If we're saying bland, like the lack of magic makes it bland. The lack of options.
No. So for me, playing a fighter in D&D is, every other class is like playing a cool WoW character, and when you're playing the fighter, you're playing RuneScape.
Oh,
And you're just doing the click to attack, and it's like you hit or you miss.
Huh.
Wow.
That's for me, my experience and how I perceive the fighter.
Have you ever played one?
I played once or twice.
What level did they get to?
Not very high.
Because I could understand that low level fighter is actually just the most boring thing.
So I think low level fighter is the most interesting because it has the most
Oh my
comparable
gosh.
features. When they get to higher levels, they're the same thing. They have slightly higher modifiers and they have a few more attacks.
Well,
All right, well,
okay.
Jake, I'm gonna step in here.
Yeah.
I'm kicking David out.
Good.
Sorry, guys. He's off the podcast.
We'll just hear me
Bye,
and
guys.
Will from now on.
Oh no. I'm surprised by this opinion actually, because I think that fighters can be very interesting. If we're judging D&D characters solely by the decisions you make in combat, combat really is only a third of the game or less if you're Jake.
Yeah. To add to that point, even in Xanathar's guide, when you look at the fighter, this is the quote. This is the flavor at the beginning. The quote says, "Let me know when you're all done talking, Tordek." And it's like, wow. It shows that this class likes combat. This class is based around combat. And when you look at the fighter philosophically, when you look at it in comparison to all the other classes, the fighter is designed to fight. It is designed for combat. It's designed for bloodshed. And that's why I think there's an easy trap that players can fall into, is because they make a fighter and they go, I want to fight. And they oftentimes, I mean, this is an easy class you can pick where you neglect backstory, you neglect any character arcs, you neglect any sort of storytelling or narrative devices, and you just go, who do I kill? And I think the only other class that's worse is the barbarian, in my opinion.
I actually think the fighter has some of the most interesting and cool backstories that you can do. It has a lot of flavor to the class. I think it's one of the most flavorful classes in the game.
Wait, David, are you a fan of the fighter or not?
No, I like the fighter as a class, but I don't like how the rules work and how it plays in 5e.
Huh. Okay.
I think that the flavor, I think that the backstory, I think all of that is great. I just think that the mechanics are lacking.
Huh.
Is that just the fighter itself or just D&D?
No, that's 5e. I think that there's missed opportunities there. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, because your opinion is wrong. I'm just thinking from my perspective, it's the opposite, right? Like, I think the fighter is fine mechanically. I think it's fairly boring when it comes to backstory, and this is one of those classes you can easily just slide into. Yeah, I'm a soldier, I'm a killer, I'm a mercenary, I kill things for a living, and just neglect every narrative hook the DM throws at you. There's really, it takes weird collaboration from the DM to really make the fighter shine from a narrative perspective, from a role-playing perspective.
So I feel like you two are both on just completely opposite ends of the spectrum here, and I'm definitely in the middle, because I don't think that mechanically the fighter suffers, and I don't think that role-playing, it has to. I think it can. Like Jake is saying, the name of everything you do is in the name of the class. Like, I'm a fighter, I fight. If you're looking at other classes, like the druid or the rogue or whoever, like the druid could do other things other than fight. You think of them as like tending a huge garden in a cave for 200 years.
Yeah.
Or the rogue is really just sort of stealing to survive.
Yeah.
Or the paladin is really, he works for a church somewhere. He does missions, like a knight kind of. But the fighter is just literally here to kill stuff. And I think that players can hook onto that and just sort of, like Jake is saying, neglect or purposefully overlook all the other stuff that you normally have to do in D&D. And I don't think you have to. In fact, I have lots to say on ways to make them really spicy and interesting. But hopefully, by the time we get to the end of this episode, both Jake and David will have a greater appreciation for each other's behavior.
Doubt it. I think that Will has a great point. So, one of the interesting things about the fighter is that with their backstory, I think it provides an interesting lens into which you can play the game. So, if you think about how you view the world, you're viewing it through this fighting lens, and it's just the way that you approach the game.
Oh, okay.
You can, and there are so many different lenses that your character might have. So your character might be a noble, so they have that lens through which they view the world. A fighter, naturally, they're gonna want to engage in combat more often and defeat them just straight up in a fight. So that's just one of the ways that you can play a fighter. And while you don't want to engage in that lens too heavily, it's also a great lens to have because some parties are afraid of combat and they just try to avoid every encounter.
That's a good point.
Having a fighter who is like, no, we can defeat them, like we can outsmart them, we can defeat them in battle. That's great.
Yeah, because it really opens you up to, as someone who loves the whole role play element and trying to talk your way out of scenarios, it really, I kind of appreciate someone who is ready to get their hands dirty. They're willing to do the hard thing. And sometimes when you look at a situation, it's like the historical kind of mythic story of the Gordian knot, where there is a knot that cannot be untied. And the person that unties it, will be given all these things. And Alexander the Great, this probably didn't happen, but he was the one who said, okay, the way to solve this, he just cut it in half. And that's something that is occasionally underrated, especially in 5e, where they give you openings of ways to creatively, charismatically get your way out of situations. Sometimes it is very cinematic to have someone be like, the only way out of this is blood. And that can be really, really, really valuable. So, bottom line, there are a ton of fighters. Why do you guys think people pick fighters so often?
The reason people pick fighters is because mechanically they're just simple. There's no spells, and I heard somebody say that spells are the worst part of D&D, but also the best part, because they're so complicated and you have to stop and read and look up everything, but then the game is just so boring and dry without it. And since low-level fighters don't have that, obviously it's very simple. However, inside of your world scenario, I like to ask why there's so many fighters. And I think this is, as we love to say, the tone anchor into your world is because D&D is a violent place, and you have to have people who are willing to fight.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
I think there's this certain empathy in the fighter class of where players, when they're thinking of characters, when they're thinking of a class they want to be, they can visualize themselves picking up a sword and running at a monster and swinging their weapon at it. Whereas, a warlock or a sorcerer, they can't imagine making a deal with some dark deity and then shooting some necrotic bolt out of their hands. They can't imagine some weird magic where they shoot lightning from their fingers. But it's pretty easy to make that leap to think about what you would do when there's a monster attacking and there's a sword right next to you. You pick up your sword and you fight the monster.
So that makes me think that psychologically, ever since we were children, we've been imagining ourselves as a great warrior, a great hero, and we've visualized that moment many times of like charging at the monster bravely with this cool suit of armor. And so it's not even a leap or a stretch to just do that in this game. And like you're saying, we don't imagine ourselves as wizards or as a paladin, which is arguably like pretty similar to a fighter in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful.
What about fighters in pop culture?
Oh my gosh. Everybody in fantasy stuff is a fighter.
That's true.
Look at Game of Thrones and point to me who is not a fighter in Game of Thrones. Like some of the women and children, but even right, like because he's a druid.
Oh yeah,
is he though?
Definitely, dude. The three.
I think he's the more guttural.
He's more of like a sorcerer.
Well, bottom line, the more like real darker fantasy, the more gritty settings like that. I mean, yeah, they're going to include more fighters because that is the way to excel in combat when magic is so rare and so foreign. Like, it's going to be full of fighters.
It's funny because that doesn't really reflect history at all. Like in medieval times, mostly everybody was a peasant and hardly anybody knew how to fight.
Well, I mean, like, there's a lot of the population that you don't see in Game of Thrones where...
True. Nobody cares about the peasant's life, like side plot.
I think in general...
Today I gotta butcher a cow.
I think in general in history, even the most fantastic tacticians and combatants, they're fighters through and through. Like, that's why it's so easy to think of a historical example of fighters, why it's so easy to empathize with someone who is holding a martial weapon and fighting an enemy, because it's throughout history.
Yeah, it's you don't even have to really use your imagination.
Mm-hmm. No.
The same goes for Lord of the Rings.
Oh man,
any war-torn fantasy world is going to have soldiers.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
I feel like the fighter should just be the soldier class.
Oh, I disagree.
Is there a soldier class?
I disagree. Because
really,
it says in the player's handbook that as a fighter, it basically says, answer these two questions. Who trained you and why are you better than the people around you? Because it says all of the soldiers that you're with, they're soldiers, but they are not fighters. The fighter class, basically baked into the class, means that you excel in fighting beyond your compatriots, beyond your fellow soldiers, beyond, the city guard that you've been with, beyond your friends, beyond your family. You are a excellent combatant. And so the main question in the player's handbook is, what makes you different? Why are you this amazing fighter? Is it because you're more ruthless? Is it because you've just trained harder? Is it because you've been given this gift from a god? Whatever. It's why are you different than your average soldier? So I think there's definitely a comparison.
Or they are similar, but not the same. I think that fighters can come from all kinds of different backgrounds. I mean, if we're talking about the stuff like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, the military is a great, easy one. Like,
that's where you're going to get a lot of them.
Yeah, I actually have not heard that description from the player's handbook about you being superior, because I always wonder, what is this awesome guy doing with this ragtag group of randos like in a tavern? And that's a question that you can answer and think about and actually take yourself to more interesting places. Maybe you washed out, maybe you got injured, maybe you got court-martialed, and now you have all this skill and know where to put it.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it really makes a point, and I think rightfully so, that you are not just an average city guardsman. You are not just a soldier. You are way better. Your martial capabilities exceed the people around you. And I think that's what separates a fighter from, a typical background of just a city guard or a standard soldier.
What other ways are there to have been trained to be a fighter that we can think of?
So you could have some sort of I'm thinking martial arts.
Okay.
So you would have some sort of maybe you were you were taken on as an apprentice, or there was some sort of fighting church. I don't want to say church.
Like a monastery.
Yeah, but like a monastery.
Yeah, this fits along with the monk in a lot of ways.
It just trains fighters.
I think this fits along with the monk in a lot of ways. Like, the way you can separate yourself from, I'm a soldier, is that you had an extreme skill with a certain weapon. And then someone took you under their wing and you were trained by this mentor that taught you the arts of combat. And that kind of aligns with a monk at a monastery in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it does, I don't know, the whole mentor aspect, and especially that mentor relationship, opens up a lot of stuff you can talk about for role playing.
So I'm envisioning a character now that is either a fighter with monk levels or vice versa.
Or a samurai.
Well, the samurai is in Xanathar's.
It's a subclass.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a little. I think it's a little different. They don't get ki, but they get something like it. But you were raised in a monastery, and maybe you were drafted, or you joined some band of mercenaries, and so you've fallen away from like that faith and that purity of weapon-free combat. But you still have all this knowledge and these connections back to the monastery. Yeah,
I think for me, this echoes so true for one of my characters that I'm running in one of my games right now. He's a samurai, and so he's a samurai fighter, and he's got this, samurai sword that's a magic weapon that's a talking sword, and the emerald in the hilt is inhabited by his old master that died. And when he
oh, that's so cool.
Does it just yell at him?
When his exactly. So when his master died, he entered his blade.
You do it harder.
And so like I have to be this as the DM, I have to be this samurai master that is dead but is inhabiting his blade, that will make stern remarks, that will guide him on the right path. And it's been really great just to see that mentor-mentee relationship play out with the fighter, specifically the samurai. It's been super cool to because a lot of times classes don't allow the DM to insert themselves. That's why my favorite classes are the paladin and the warlock, because the paladin has their oath and kind of their group that they're with, and then the warlock has their patron. And those two things allow the DM to insert themselves and kind of be like, do these things, or they kind of give a little more puppeteer strings to the whole nature of the character. But the fighter in general lacks that a lot. And so having kind of the samurai,
I think
with this thing in the hilt, with his mentor talking to him, adds that flavor to it that it otherwise doesn't have. What do you think, David? Because I don't think it has that enough.
I think it does. You're just like not being creative enough.
But like, he was when he's got the gem in the hilt.
No. I'm saying that's a good workaround for that problem that you have. And you could have other mentors. You could have other military colleagues. You got trained somehow. You didn't just magically get to being a badass fighter.
Right, but he's saying that in terms of having a voice with the party all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that you can do it, but it takes more work. Like, admit it. The paladin and the warlock have those baked into the classes, whereas the fighter, you have to really work to have I don't
think it's that much more work. I think you're over exaggerating.
What? David,
okay.
Why are you being combative?
Because it's the fighter.
He's fighting.
I see. There's a theme here. I was going to say, for class training. So this is something that has always kind of bothered me about 5e right now, is that you just level up and you're out in a cave 3 floors down, and like, I suddenly know all these other moves overnight because I had 8 hours of sleep and I can just do that. But with this Jim and the Hilt mentor thing, you can explain it away and say like, oh no, like when he's alone, he's practicing his moves with his master's like tutelage, and so he's literally like training all the time.
Yeah,
and that's such a great explanation for leveling up in the field.
No, that's cool.
It fits so well because he always says like, his character is very martial. He wants to, do the best combat he can. And he's always like, I wake up earlier than my compatriots. I want to start training. And he always talks to his sword, which is hilariously kind of hard for me because his sword is, it's his mentor, but his mentor is a very, very, very Japanese stereotype. And so he'll talk to him and make me roleplay as this sword, and the whole table will just burst out laughing as I'm trying to do this like stern Mr. Miyagi type Japanese mentor.
So I have a question. So how do you dungeon master for a fighter as opposed to how you play a fighter? Like, are they very different?
I think. Yeah, so I don't know. It's coming from completely different perspectives, because when I am playing as a fighter, I guess I am looking for ways that the DM can latch on to some of my backstory in order to make my fighter more interesting, because you guys know I like the roleplay nature of D&D more. So as a fighter, because there's not much baked into the class itself that the DM can work with, I always want to think of like, what was the last mercenary gang I was a part of? Who was my mentor? All this stuff that like the DM can work with. And the same thing goes, flipping it to the DM. If I'm dungeon mastering for a fighter, I want to find some of those hooks that I can dig into, that I can pull out. Who is his mentor? Who is the last army he was affiliated with? Who was the person that he took orders from? All that stuff, so I can bake it into the plot. But I think the general thing with fighters as a DM is give them opportunities to shine. Let them fight.
Let them fight.
Like, that's the bottom line. If you have a fighter in your party, you got to have some really, really cool combat encounters to let them shine.
I would add in here, I feel like people overlook the archer archetype of fighter.
Oh, definitely.
Because just because you're a fighter doesn't mean you're a frontline guy. Like fighters are just this huge damaging potential in terms of combat. But I also like that idea of, I guess it's not Aragorn, but more of Boromir, who's in the back, and he can do up close or far away.
Or Legolas.
Legolas probably more like a ranger, because he did a lot of tracking.
Yeah, but he didn't really cast any spells.
Yeah, he's on the edge.
Arguably those like tricks he did that defy like human physics.
Oh my gosh.
He was definitely using magic on that.
That was movie magic.
So what are some of the pros and cons of playing a fighter? What have we not gone over?
Are you talking about like the mechanics? Because I think there's a lot of mechanics we can explore in the subclasses, because they vary wildly.
Yeah, they do. And that's something I like about 5e is just, I think in the core rules, everybody has at least 3 subclasses. Very cool. So let's get into that now. So at level 3, the fighter can specialize into either the champion, the battlemaster, or the eldritch knight.
All right, so the subclasses, I mean, I feel like if you have a player that's very new to D&D, fighter is a great way to just introduce them to combat in this system. I feel like champion and battlemaster are really, really simple and effective. They aren't complicated, and they don't have many detrimental qualities to them. I really oftentimes will point new players in this direction.
For the battlemaster?
Both champion and battlemaster.
So I think the champion is simpler. It looks like all you get is a 5% more chance to crit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's...
And then better
you get some
stats.
proficiency boosts and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's pretty simple.
So it's very simple. If you want someone, if someone is not good with systems like game systems, give them the champion.
Yep.
That's a great way to just give them a basic class that it gives them some numbers boost, but it doesn't really add a whole lot to the class, so they're not having to worry about, oh, I have this skill and this skill and this skill to worry about.
This is the class for the significant other who's just dropping in for the night, or like if somebody has left and they're just a no-show, you can take it over easily enough, and it really doesn't complicate your life at all, because there's no decisions to make. You just roll a dice, you just swing your sword, and stuff dies.
Yeah.
Solid.
And next up we have the Battlemaster. And I think this is, out of all of the fighter subclasses, I think this is the most interesting and probably my favorite. Just because it has the most unique decisions that you can make. Because you get all sorts of maneuvers.
Oh, in terms of the fighter?
Yeah, in terms of the fighter, and just in terms of all of the subclasses that it has. This one I think is the most well designed, and I think it's the most fun to play because you're given more options.
Yeah, I think this one also opens up a lot of opportunities for roleplay, because a lot of the tactics and the maneuvers can add a lot of flavor that the warrior, the standard fighter, is kind of missing. And so yeah, these maneuvers add something that I think makes the fighter something more complex than it is designed to be, just a classic boring warrior.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
No, I wouldn't use the word boring, because if you like, if the DM is competent at making engaging combats, if you think of the group of D&D as being more than the sum of its parts, and the fighter is this crucial element of that. Even if you ran even 2 fighters, you would have some amazing interchange. Like, let's say between a Battlemaster and an Eldritch Knight. Like, even within the same class, play this in the same party, but with different subclasses, you'll have a lot of different feel.
Oh, absolutely. I think the fighter, perhaps between its subclasses, with Xanathar's Guide subclasses too, I think it has the most variance between its subclasses compared to any other classes subclasses.
I guess I agree. I think that some of the subclasses are on the weaker end in terms of interesting design space, but they are, like, mechanically you're going to be playing them differently, especially when you consider like the Arcane Archer and the Eldritch Knight. They're going to be relatively different to the Battlemaster or the Champion.
Yeah. One last word on the Battlemaster. They have an ability called Know Your Enemy. And what that means is that if you study an enemy before you fight it, you get some statistical insight into that creature.
Oh,
The way I run the game is that I reveal that information after the first round of combat, so they'll know the AC, and they'll obviously be seeing how much damage a monster is dealing. So this is kind of interesting for me to kind of say, because I'm revealing that info already. For a fighter doing this, I might even give them the exact hit point count or like saving throw numbers or whatever. Because I want to reward them for like sizing up this fight before it happens and taking that time. I think it's interesting and fun.
Yeah, I think for me, I don't give that information very freely. So the Battlemaster getting that info is it's a big deal. That info is, I think, a little more valuable.
Yeah.
I have in one of my current campaigns a Eldritch Knight, and it's been a blast to see the different stuff that he has available. I think he's role-playing, he's a tiefling. So for me, the big deal is reflavoring some of the spells to fit with the Eldritch Knight, because this character that I have in my party is a tiefling. We just reflavored some of his spells that he gets normally just to fit his character more. So he has one, I think is a cantrip, maybe it's first level spell, is the Poison Spray, and we just reflavored it as Lava Spray. And it fits the character so much more as kind of the fire of the tiefling, the demon, and it does the same damage, whatever, but it just fits so much better. I don't know. From what I've experienced from the Eldritch Knight, I've loved it. I feel like it's been super fun because it's like they have the same fighter stuff, but they have a lot of cool tactical stuff with their spells that they can use in situations that the DM wouldn't expect.
Those cantrips that they get are a little weak in just the player's handbook, but if you get the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, and I would suggest just get it on D&D Beyond because it's probably not worth having in physical form, you get a lot better pool of cantrips and the class just becomes better.
Yeah.
Or the subclass rather.
Huh. I think
otherwise the cantrips kind of suck.
I think for me,
the damage is just not great.
I think for me, I'm so flexible with spells, I've probably negotiated those cantrips up better than what they usually are because I don't follow the book spells to a T.
No, I'm surprised you followed them at all.
Yeah.
So let's get into the 3 from Xanathar's Guide. I think these really add a lot to the class, like a ton. So what do you guys think of the Arcane Archer, the Cavalier, and the Samurai?
So from what I understand about the Arcane Archer, they've just taken the idea of the Archer type fighter and given you magic arrows. So you have this chance to pick a whole bunch of them. I think there's 6 or 7 different ones, and they do things like bursting into flame or grappling people to the ground, kind of like a net. All kinds of things. And you can probably make up more if your DM is flexible. It was pretty cool. I have not played it.
Yeah, I think the whole archer aspect of the fighter is just severely underrated. Like when a fighter that they're good at martial weapons, like a bow and arrow is included in that. And so I feel like it's underrated, and the Arcane Archer seeks to kind of showcase the skill from that type of archetype. But at the same time, I think the Arcane Archer is a little weak from a just systems perspective. I don't know. David's the one that would have a better perspective on that. But from what I've heard on Reddit and whatnot, that the Arcane Archer is just it's a little weak unless you have a cool flavor to add to it.
I've heard it's weak.
One of the things that I really don't like about it is the fact that you are so limited on which types of arrows you can pick. You're only limited to 3 at first. I would really like it if you had the whole list. So you had more options to choose from as you're going through. I think adding decisions to the game just makes the game better.
I think you're right. Like, I would probably open up the whole list and then just design upgraded versions of the arrows. So instead of choosing an additional style, as the class guide makes you do, you would just choose an upgrade to that. So you have more utility, but then you can still focus in on what you use the most.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about this more later when we go over some of my complaints with the fighter class.
Yeah, I think the Arcane Archer, they could have focused on the utility a little more, but they kind of didn't. Overall, I'd be eager to see that kind of class, especially I'd be eager to play it because my type of players are less, systems based, and I don't really care about the numbers as much. But I feel like with flavor, you could add some really cool elements to that subclass.
Yeah. Next up, we have the Cavalier. It's like a knight, but not quite. You have a horse and all kinds of stuff you can do with the horse. However, the class can exist without the horse.
You're basically focused on mounted combat a lot of the time. Think about it's kind of like you're jousting all the time.
Yeah, I really, really like this class. From what I've heard, this is an amazing class for anyone who wants to be a tank, who wants to protect their party members, who wants to kind of have some crowd control over enemies. And I think the real flavor comes from, it doesn't have to be a horse that you're riding. Like the Cavalier has a mount, but I mean, that mount, what your mount is changes the class entirely. If you're riding a turtle, it completely changes the class. Like if you're riding a Velociraptor, it completely changes the class. Right? And so having the different mounts.
If you're riding a griffin.
Yeah. Like all these mounts change the class entirely. So I think with a creative player, like the Cavalier can become a really, really good tank and just a really interesting class in general.
I could envision a little campaign idea where you have maybe a lot more travel than you have in your average D&D campaign, and everybody has mounts. And so this would be a great pick for that kind of thing because he has a lot of abilities to trigger off of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of wide open spaces. I think Lord of the Rings did a lot of these field battles that honestly I don't think I've ever done in D&D just because mass combat seems scary daunting. And slow.
Yeah.
Very daunting. But there's a place for this. There's a place for all of these subclasses, I think, in certain games. Finally, we have the Samurai. As Jake was mentioning earlier, this is a... Jake, how would you describe this?
I mean, their whole class is based on advantage, which I think is an incredibly interesting system they introduced in 5e. And I think the Samurai is amazing. This is the class I've been really, really, really wanting to play since Xanathars came out. It's between this and the Hexblade Warlock, obviously. This just seems so fun. And so currently it's been really great to live vicariously through one of my players who has a Samurai. And it has been so cool to see how they... basically because this player is kind of a min-maxer, kind of a power gamer. And just to see how they really utilize every part of the Samurai to get the greatest gain from it. It's been really incredible to see. I think the Samurai is a super cool addition to the fighter subclasses.
There's an ability they get at level 7 called the Elegant Courtier. And all of that it means is you excel in social situations and you get some other bonuses. And I think that's really fun just because you are this regal and very sophisticated fighter, which maybe you wouldn't normally think of when you're building a fighter. You think of them as being this gruff ex-military, whatever. But this guy is very elegant, and he knows his way around a conversation.
Very noble.
Yeah.
They're all about that respect.
I love that.
PCT.
Like, just having any inputs of flavor into the fighter class itself is like really just refreshing as a more role play focused DM.
I have some problems with the fighter class as it is in 5e. And I'm not talking about balance-wise, because balance-wise, it's pretty good. If you want to deal damage, it's really good at dealing damage. You get tons of extra attacks, you get tons of modifiers and boosts that just amp up your damage a lot. And if you're looking at the backgrounds are great. Where I think it lacks is in combat, where it accelerates, you don't have many decisions that you can make. Almost always the basic decision that you're going to make is, I swing my sword at my enemy. And some of the problems that I have is, when wielding different weapons, combat feels the same. If I'm wielding a great axe versus a short sword, I'm going to attack virtually the same way. When in reality, those would play out very differently in those kinds of situations.
Would they, though? I mean, the end result is somebody dying.
Yeah, but if you're imagining a sword fight between someone who's like swinging and lugging a huge axe versus like kind of bobbing and weaving and just jabbing at your opponent with a sword, that feels different. And I feel like that kind of fighting aspect is lost in 5e for the most part. Without narration,
I mean,
it's not captured in the system at all. Also, I feel like there's no dynamicness to the combat. You're not necessarily playing off each other. It's just, I try to hit him, I miss. He tries to hit me, he misses. There's no back and forth dynamic. If you watch, I don't know, the movies or Lord of the Rings, you're seeing people play off each other, and that's just kind of lost in the system. And there's so much room for them to develop things involving reactions, involving aiding other people. And I feel like there's a lot of design space that they've missed out on. And I feel like they could have done more with the fighter. So
I don't know.
That's just kind of like my opinion.
I feel like all that stuff you said, kind of discarding narration. Like, I feel like all of this stuff relies on the narration of the DM and even the players. Be like, describe to me how you miss. You know, if you're the DM, just ask them that. Just be like, how do you hit them? You know, the famous Matt Mercer, how do you want to do this? Mm-hmm. And like, all that stuff is implied in the DM's narration. I don't know if you bake that into the system. I don't know if it gets too complex for new players that are joining in, right?
I think there are ways that you can work around it.
I think, okay, so I personally don't think that you need to model specific weapon feels inside the system.
Sure.
Because I think that, I really don't know if there's a way to do that without really slowing down combat even more. And combat is something that I personally feel like needs to be streamlined a lot for 5e, but that's my burden to bear. As for what David's saying, I really don't think the weapons necessarily need to feel different. I think that what you're saying about the combat's being boring and dry, but I hit you. If we're looking at any combat from a movie and you have, let's say in The Hobbit, the barrel chase scene. Oh, that was great. It's a great scene in an abysmal film. It's a great D&D kind of moment, right? Because it's just over the top all the time. And really all they're doing is you're escorting people down a river, you can't control the speed, and then you're just sort of running along the environment. And I think it's up to the DM in a lot of ways to set the scene and set the battle in an interesting place. I personally definitely fall down in this area where my combats tend to be, here's a wide open field, and maybe there's like, a big tree in the middle, and now you fight, and everybody stands there and everybody rolls dice until the combat is over. So I definitely understand that. But I don't know if the fighter is the mechanical knobs that we need to tune and turn to make that happen.
I just think that they haven't been developed yet, because I don't know, if you look at all of the other classes, so you have like the wizard, and they have all sorts of spells that they can cast that have a variety of applications in different situations, and you have the druid who has so many different wild shapes, and you have the paladin who has this divine intervention that they can call upon, but the fighter, they don't really have many decisions that they can make. There's not a whole lot of choice that you can make other than I attack.
Well, I think that the class is actually designed for the type of player who would prefer to have less choices.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, because if you want more gameplay, you just pick something else.
Yeah.
Like a monk, for instance.
Okay.
Maybe that's why I don't like the fighters, because I like choices, and
they don't have a lot.
And they don't have a lot of choices, but I guess some people are okay with that. And
the people who play D&D while drinking heavily would love a fighter.
Maybe the fighter wasn't designed for me. Like, the more I think about this, it's like, maybe it's just a class that I'm just not meant to play.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But I just haven't thought about that before.
It's happening, Jake. We've changed his mind. So now instead of being poorly designed, it's just poorly designed for you.
Exactly.
Good.
Okay, so looking at everything we've said, what are ways that we as DMs can improve fighters?
Well, when we say improve, I think David is thinking mechanically. I'm definitely thinking from a role play perspective.
Yeah.
And then Jake is looking for ways to hook it into the overall game. Actually, the first thing that comes to mind, oddly enough, is the Edge of the Empire skill system. So in D&D, they have feats that you can buy, a kind of optional rule. It's in the back of the book. I've never used them, but a lot of people really love them.
What? You haven't used feats?
Dude, I'm telling you, combat is the slowest part of the game. And
but a lot of the feats aren't combat. A lot of them just make the... Honestly, I think a lot of the feats make the combat faster, especially if someone's optimizing your character. Yeah.
You know what I'm going to do to make the combat faster? I'm going to half health and double damage. That'll be fast. Anyway, in Edge of the Empire, they have skill trees. And so you spend points as you level up, you get skill points, and you spend those to unlock new skills. And I like the idea of having something like that. It maybe not class specific, but like feats that you can have a varying power, and you hide them at the bottom of the tree. Is it weird that I'm designing a feature that I would never actually use in the game? I'm realizing that right now.
Yeah, because I feel like adding mechanical parts to an already designed game can work, but it is exhausting, and it will either be ignored by the more roleplay type characters, and it will be exploited by the more min-maxing power game type players, right?
Oh, but Jake, the mechanical tinkering is part of the fun of D&D.
I think that's where you and David are.
It's the only reason I play.
You and David are ridiculous goobers.
Yeah.
Because
now it is kind of weird because the average person doesn't think about this stuff, and David and I definitely do.
Because for me, when I'm thinking how to improve a fighter, fighters are about their armaments, right? They're about their weapons and their armor. They're very combat focused, but those items are very important to them. So to improve a fighter, I want to give them magic items, a lot of them, in order to make their character interesting, in order to give them certain abilities they might not have otherwise. So I think fighters are some of the classes that benefit best from very unique and very frequent additions of magic items.
That's true. And maybe we've looked at this kind of in a vacuum when normally a fighter is not the only person in the party. I'm imagining how a fighter can change just by giving them the fly spell.
Oh.
They fly up above an enemy and just drop down like Link, right? And they just destroy them. And so maybe there's a lot of interaction that we haven't thought about. And I think giving items away is it is actually mechanically tinkering with the game, Jake.
Yes. Oh yeah, I would agree.
Items,
but I don't have to do any math myself.
You're on board, boy.
That's true.
So I'm trying to think of a different class that relies on their items as much as the fighter. And I think the fighter relies on their weapons and armor the most of any class by far.
So I think for me, in terms of improving the fighter class, one of the things that you can do is you can be more loose in terms of, as a DM, you can be more loose in terms of interpreting gameplay rules. So if you have a fighter who is wielding a great axe and he says, I want to cleave all of my enemies in front of me, you can let him make attack rolls on 3 people in front of him. I think that's more interesting and more fun gameplay wise because it gives them more opportunity to be more creative in how they play and how they attack their enemies. Or if they say they're shooting a fireball at me, I want to try to block with my shield, I would give them some sort of advantage or something on that save because they're trying to play the class better and they're doing a better job at role playing, and I think that should be rewarded.
I think I'm actually going to run a 2nd edition D&D campaign where the rules are almost entirely fuzzy and up for interpretation, because I think that David would enjoy that.
I want to try it. Yeah.
I don't know if David would like it because it like if you make a game that is completely fuzzy, then you can't manipulate it.
That's why I'm curious to try, because or you can.
You can manipulate it to a greater extent.
But then if I'm running combat as war, then it's going to look different. I heard a really interesting explanation of old school D&D versus the modern D&D, and that is in old school D&D, your character was weak, and they are trying to survive the world because the world is going to kill them. And in new D&D or modern D&D, the world is trying to survive the characters.
Oh,
it's a complete dichotomy shift.
Oh, that changes everything.
Because the characters are super people.
Yeah. So one of the things that game designers strive to do is they strive to achieve balance. And I'm wondering if that's not a good thing to achieve. I'm wondering if the thing to achieve is the most brokenness.
What?
So you have wizards that are absurdly strong and fighters who are absurdly strong. Like, what happens in those situations when, people who are extremely strong clash? I think that's more interesting than a very balanced fight that's always, precise.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like, if we have a war of gods,
Yeah.
and both of them can destroy anyone, then I don't know. I think it's gonna be one-sided either way. Because someone's going to be just automatically more powerful. Like a 20th level fighter versus a 20th level wizard. The wizard's going to polymorph him and then just crush him.
I don't know.
Put him in a force cage and just torture him to death.
There are ways that the fighter could win.
Maybe
1v1 me, bro.
Yeah, we should test it out. Like 20 and 20.
Okay, so the fighters for me, why I will sometimes point my players to different classes is because the fighters give you an excuse not to care about your background, not to care about your personality traits, not to care about your role playing. Like, it just gives you an outlet where you can just commit total violence, and not think about the ramifications socially or from a role play perspective. So, for me, I think the fighter, because it doesn't have these things baked into them, it doesn't have natural DM hooks baked into it, I think that's where you should really push your players, if you're their DM, to think of very complex or interesting backstories for the fighter to really give it that much more flavor.
I have some really great backstories I want to lay on you guys.
Well, let's just go.
They're from silly sources.
Well, yeah, let's just go into
let's go
some character concepts for fighters that you think are creative or unique or whatever.
Okay, so I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking about all these different fighters. I thought about John Wick, but then, whatever. So but I didn't do John Wick. I was thinking about just challenging myself, and I came to Disney films. So if I was going to base a backstory on the idea of something from Disney, the first one is Aladdin. So I would have a fighter whose dad was in Aladdin's situation and did the Prince Ali thing, like he wished to be a noble, but he's not actually. Like, he just has a bunch of money and wishes. And so this fighter comes from a noble family that nobody respects because he's not real. Like, just he's new money. And so you have, and so that's where you're training, because your dad was just like not a beggar, but some like really low end, street rat guy.
Yeah.
So that's my first one. My second is based on Frozen.
Weird.
So this fighter, he is it Elsa is the one with the frost powers?
Yeah, I feel like she's a sorcerer.
This fighter is an eldritch. So, it's my riff on it, right? So, Elsa or Anna or whoever, I've only seen it one time, guys. I'm sorry. Let it go. This is the first time I've said it in 2018. So your fighter is the one who's expressing these uncontrollable powers. They don't necessarily have to be frost powers, but you would build that into your Eldritch Knight as you're leveling up and you're learning how to control them. Maybe you're from this kingdom that's way up in the north, this Scandinavian country, and you've traveled down because you're sort of exiled, because you've damaged or even killed some of your family members or people close to the family. So you're an exile with powers. Great. And the last one I have, of all of the films I could have picked, I picked Lilo and Stitch. This is my favorite one. So in Lilo and Stitch, Stitch is this experiment who comes from space and he gets trapped on Hawaii, and that's like the basis of the film. So I took the idea of something falling from space onto an island. So this fighter has a sword, and the sword is like Stitch in this scenario. But it's highly magical, only in the sense that the fighter is a regular person and can only fight when holding the sword. And so if ever you drop your sword, you cease to be a fighter. So at level 1, you have a quote-unquote magic sword that statistically is not doing anything, but it is all of the power. And the fighter, he just won't let anybody else touch his sword, because then they will become this great fighter. And this explains how it's leveling up, because the sword is learning how to puppet the body of the fighter more efficiently. And so it's already a hyper-powered, like 20th level fighter, but it's just, he's the one unlocking the ability.
That's really cool.
Thank you. And it's based on Lilo and Stitch.
I love that.
Would you look at that?
All right, Dave, do you have one? Character concept for a fighter?
Do I have any interesting concepts for a fighter? No.
No.
I honestly don't.
So for me, I love the Battlemaster fighter, but kind of reflavored into an older class from an earlier edition of D&D, like the Warlord, which is like a commanding officer type fighter. So essentially the way I think of making it in D&D 5e is multi-classing a Battlemaster fighter with a bard. And so using your bardic inspiration as like you giving orders, like I love that concept of like this very charismatic fighter that's just an inherent leader. It kind of reminds me of the Star Wars Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion, that system. Instead of charisma, they have a stat called presence. And presence is kind of like this, it's not necessarily like charming, charlatan type, getting around things, charisma. It's being able to command troops and being able to get people to follow orders and getting people to follow you. And so I love the idea of like this Battlemaster fighter that's just a commander of troops, and that he can give kind of tactical orders, and he can do his Battlemaster maneuvers from his subclass, but at the same time he can be handing out bardic inspiration from the bard class. I just love that idea as like this leader.
He's like pointing at party members and barking orders, and that is your command die.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that that's not a class.
Yeah, I think they've been debating putting in a Warlord class or subclass.
That's a really great concept. Definitely less silly than mine, but I love it.
All right, let's go in the vault.
Welcome to this week's Question Vault. If you have a question for us, you can email it to voxarcanapodcast@gmail.com. This week's question comes from Charlie. He asks, what are the pros and cons of having a detailed world map? Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie.
Oh, I mean,
I think that if you go into detail too early on and you've already made the whole map, what else is there to explore?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say.
If you've made the whole world map, then everything has already been explored. I like the idea of having a blank map and then you slowly fill it in as you go along, and it slowly becomes more and more detailed.
I might do like have a whole world and you maybe have highlighted big cities, like some of them, but mostly the map is blank. And that way the players can say, oh, well, I know this person here.
Or even further, one of the other ideas I have is that you give them a map that is wrong. So it has things on the map that are wrong. So it's like they were sold, someone sold them the map in game, like a vendor or something, and the map has all sorts of interesting annotations and interesting marks. And it's like maybe like there's a treasure hidden dungeon somewhere, or there's like a city that doesn't exist. Like all of those things could be really cool.
Cool. Okay, so going back to what you guys said about like wanting to make your own map or just like leaving a map blank, I fundamentally disagree. Like when I get a video game, when I open up the Witcher or the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, they include in it a map. And you open up that map and you read it and you're like, oh my God, this is so cool. And it makes you want to play the game more. And so maybe it's because I've been playing in a world that's had a map that I've drawn that's like we've used for, 3 years. But I love the idea of a map and seeing, a place named something and you're like, I want to go there. Like what is this thing,
I want to go to Markarth.
Yeah, seeing a town name or seeing a weird thing on the map. Like one of my in my map, there's just a big lake and there's a big orb in the middle of it, and it's just called Starfall Lake, and it's where an asteroid hit 1,000 years ago, and that has never come up in any of my campaigns so far. But that part of the map, I'm hoping my players see that and go, that's interesting. Like, I'm intrigued, and it makes them want to be a part of the world more. So I don't know. I don't know if the cons are enough to stop a good DM from making a well-detailed map,
Well, sounds like we all disagree. Thanks, Charlie.
Look what you frickin' done, Charlie.
And that's the vault, folks. Thank you for listening to Vox Arcana episode 12. I'm William.
I'm Jake.
And I'm David.
We'll see you next time. Follow us on social media. Our Twitter is @VoxArcanaPod. Our Facebook is @VoxArcanaPodcast. Instagram is the same. Email is voxarcanapodcast@gmail.com. If you find the golden ticket hidden in one of our episodes, you'll win a tour of our D&D factory.